for joining us. This is our panel on statues, monuments, but really more generally, let's just call it history in the public square, because I think that's really what we're going to be discussing today. And so thanks again for joining. And I'd also, of course, like to thank Karen and Joe for all the work they've done to keep this conference moving smoothly. And the fact that we started right at 2, I think, is a testament to that. I'd also like to thank the rest of the conference committee for putting together this excellent program. And I also wish to acknowledge the Dena'ina people on whose land I am moderating this discussion over here in lovely Spenard, Alaska, United States. And of course, I'd like to thank the discussants for participating. So I'll just take a couple of minutes to introduce each one. I'll then provide a little brief intro and pose the first question. And then maybe over the next 30, 45 minutes or so, give or take, I'll go ahead and moderate the discussion, posing a few questions. And then maybe the back half of this, the last 30 minutes or so, we'll open things up for discussion for the broader audience to go ahead and weigh in and pose questions, comments, or develop the conversation or a few of the points that we bring up a little bit more. So in alphabetical order, we've got Ross Coen. Ross has served as faculty at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in the history department. He's authored Breaking Ice for Arctic Oil, The Longview Dispatches on Alaska History, and Fugo, The Curious History of Japan's Balloon Bomb Attack on America. Coen is also the editor of Alaska History, the journal of the Alaska Historical Society, and he has reminded me to encourage presenters to submit a manuscript. And again, I will certainly plug this not once, but twice, and maybe a couple more times throughout this panel. I have personally been at several of these panels, and there are some amazing presenters and some great topics and some great papers that I think would fit really well into the journal, and I'm sure that Ross would be happy to work with you on getting some of those published. We also have Mary Ehrlander, who has served as faculty at UAF as professor of history and director of Arctic and Northern Studies. Mary has written or co-written five books and dozens of articles and scholarly reviews. Her most recent works include The Big Wild Soul of Terence Cole. That's with Frank Seuss. These are essays in honor of the great UAF history professor, Terence Cole. And she's also recently written Walter Harper, Alaska Native Son. She's been named Alaska Historian of the Year and just recently retired from UAF, but I'm exceedingly happy that she's agreed to participate in this panel and take some time out of her schedule to do so. So thank you, Mary. We also have Aaron Leggett. Aaron was born in Anchorage and is Dena'ina Athabascan. He is Senior Curator of Alaska History and Indigenous Culture at the Anchorage Museum, and has worked for Anchorage Historic Preservation Commission, the Dena'ina Cultural. He's also been the Dena'ina Cultural Historian and Curator of Collections and Exhibits at the Alaska Native Heritage Center. Mr. Leggett is also President and Chair of the Tribal Council of the Native Village of Eklutna, and he has served as a conservation advisor for Sharing Our Knowledge Project, as well as an exhibition advisor for the Living Our Cultures exhibit. Aaron has co-edited the impressive collection of essays, The Dena'ina Way of Living, and has been instrumental to the museum as an historian and anthropologist. So I think you would all agree that we have an all-star cast of panelists who will be able to weigh in really insightfully, thoughtfully, and thoroughly on the questions I'll propose. So that's who we've got with us. And just to, I think, maybe introduce this topic, and I've been, frankly, really looking forward to opening up this discussion because I think it's an important one. And so I'll just say a couple of things briefly, none of which are meant to be kind of, too controversial. But the point I would make here is I do think we are living in an era of divisiveness. And I think that era of divisiveness has kind of stemmed from the 45th president on down. We're also in the midst of a pandemic that has had a disproportionate impact upon communities of color. And the latest episodes of police violence from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor have, in my mind, provoked a more serious discussion about racism that has occurred in our country, certainly at any point in my lifetime. Some of this conversation has revolved around the nation's well-documented history of systemic injustice. We in Alaska have taken part in this national dialogue. Part of that dialogue has involved a critique of what some have called commemorative landscapes. This has included statues, monuments, place names, and public displays of historical events of one kind or another. Now, although Alaska was obviously never part of the Confederacy, unless I missed that lecture in school, And we do lack the public memorialization of such figures as Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, to name just a few. The state has no shortage of statues and monuments that celebrate figures widely associated with the history of colonialism and European settlement. This history has in part left a legacy of trauma, hardship, and despair among Alaska's disparate indigenous communities. With that said, and here's, I think, that's the wind-up pitch for the first question here. With that said, how do we fashion commemorative landscapes that fully grapple with the complexity of history and provide an inclusive narrative that meaningfully wrestles with the past? Should we tear down the statues and simply start again? Or maybe nix the idea of public monuments and reconceive of our public spaces in new and creative ways? So, again, I set this up alphabetically with Ross, Mary, and Aaron by last name, but any three of you can feel free to jump in.
Well, I won't be shy about going first. Ian, that's a great question. That's a good way of starting this. And I think the thing that occurs to me about what kinds of commemorations we have or should have, it calls to mind, for me at least, what I think is one of the best public historical commemorations that I've seen in Alaska in my 25 years of living in the state. And that is the statues of the anonymous Alaska Territorial Guard soldier that were posted around the state, I think about 10 years ago. There's one in Anchorage, there's one in Fairbanks, there's one in Nome. I think there's at least 4 or 5 others at different communities around the state. And what makes that commemoration really so exquisite to my mind is that it's not a statue of a specific named individual, but rather it's a statue of an anonymous Guard member who served in the Territorial Guard. And so in that respect, it's a memorial that everyone can see themselves reflected in. You don't have to have a personal connection to the honored individual, nor do we have to examine the personal characteristics of the honored individual to see if they are quote unquote worthy of a commemoration. Rather, it's this more general type of monument that's open to everyone. Now, think about how that would change if, the commander of the Alaska Territorial Guard in Western Alaska was Marvin Muktuk Marston, a phenomenal individual with an incredible record of public service who by rights may himself be deserving of a statue. But just think how that memorial would change if instead of the anonymous ATG soldier, we put up a statue to Muktuk Marston. Now it's more closely connected to the individual, and for me, something is lost.
I'll jump in here. In thinking about your question, Ian, I think part of there's a fundamental problem in Alaska, and that is that Alaska history is not told or taught, or what is taught is a very limited scope. And so I think to have the statues that we have, let me say, some of the statues that there is contention around, I think it's reflected in the fact that most Alaskans don't know Alaskan history, or they only know a very narrow scope of Alaska history. So to me, if you're going to put up more statues, we have to be educated about our history and what is, what are, the different perspectives on various issues. The one I'm most closely associated with, obviously, is the Captain Cook statue. And I was well quoted both nationally and internationally, actually, on that one. And my point was that the recorded, narrative that there is lacking an Indigenous perspective. And it also kind of emphasizes in one way sort of what was Captain Cook's contribution to this area, and it kind of inflates it in some ways. But I think that's a reflection of Anchorage itself not really having an identity and wanting to glom onto this guy that was here for 2 weeks and never got off the ship. So we have this sort of, the joke is that Alaska history begins when you arrived for the most part. And I think we have to change that narrative. And I think it's critical that it's being taught in our schools and being taught well.
Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah, I can't disagree with anything that Ross and Aaron have said. I think they've made really valuable points. I guess I would just add a couple, including that I think that there is a place for statues and commemorative landscapes. They can educate us about the past in very valuable ways. And while I love the idea of the statue of the territorial guardsman, I also think there is a place for individuals, for statues of individuals. They should be contextualized with interpretive panels so that people understand the history surrounding this individual. But I think that we need human beings, children in particular, but even adults, need role models. We need heroes. We need people to look up to. And it's true that our perceptions of what and who are heroic may change from generation to generation. Nevertheless, to have someone who can represent guiding principles, I think is vital to individual growth and to the health of societies. And, you know, I'm just thinking like right now, and I don't want to get too political and contentious, but my goodness, you know, how often recently haven't we, you know, on the national level talked about, you know, who are good presidential role models? And so that's just one example. I do think that in Alaska, that that commemorative landscapes and statues moving forward should really be dedicated largely to complicating the narrative, bringing in many more perspectives than the largely, you know, white male history that we've had.
Yeah, thank you, Mary, and thank you all. Those, I think each of your responses kind of paved the way to the next question that I have, and each of these are going to be somewhat related to the next. And if I get off track by any means, please do feel free to kind of, you know, answer it in the way that you please, or redirect the questions. It's a loose format, but, you know, to kind of build off of that point, to what extent do your answers in that first question really hinge upon who is being memorialized? And I think this is going to be something that a lot of folks will have pretty strong opinions about. You know, we're here in Alaska, and we were looking down maybe at the American South, and we see these Confederate monuments, for example, and they present a pretty straightforward and easy case for removal, in my opinion. And I think the reason why is because these are figures who fought really explicitly for slavery and a government rooted to white supremacy, right? You can read Alexander H. Stevens's famous Cornerstone speech to get a sense of what the Confederacy was quite explicitly about. And these were figures who left the Union to uphold those ideals. Most of those statues and monuments in Alaska are arguably, in some cases, maybe not all, but in some cases, a little bit more nuanced. And I'm, you know, thinking of those depicting William H. Seward, at once a fierce proponent of American expansion, but also kind of an aggressive opponent of slavery. In fact, kind of a radical abolitionist, but his views on race were pretty offensive, certainly to our modern ears and eyes as we've read some of the things he said. We could talk about Captain Cook, as Aaron already brought up. He's a figure that's widely praised for his advances in navigation, but also viewed with deep ambivalence among Indigenous people around the world as a symbol of British imperialism and the elevation of white rule. So, well, what do we do with the figures who might have a more contested public image? Are there statues, monuments, or place names of figures in Alaska that present a more clear-cut case for removal than others? Is a removal of a statue maybe never the responsible way to go? Or what do we do in a place like Alaska that I think is maybe has a few more shades of gray than, I don't know, a Confederate monument, say, in Richmond or something along those lines.
Well, I'll go first again. Aaron, Mary.
I'm happy to call on people here, but no.
Ian, I think you raise a good point. I mean, to what extent are these answers or these connections made with regard to the specific individuals? One point that I feel like I could almost give this answer to every question that's asked on this topic, and that is that statues are not really about the past. They're about the moment in which they were erected. And statues and other forms of historical commemoration always say more about the individuals who put them up than about the honored individual, him or herself. Some of you may recall, I wrote a column in the Anchorage Daily News several years ago about the William Seward statue, not the one in Juneau, but the one that's in Seattle. Those of you who have been to Volunteer Park in Seattle know that there's a statue of William Seward that has stood there since 1909. And you know, if you were wandering through the park, you may think, why is there a statue of William Seward in Seattle that was erected in 1909? It makes no sense. He's clearly a major figure of 19th century history, but he has no connection to Seattle. And what was happening in 1909 that caused Seattleites to put up the statue of this New Yorker who never visited? And the answer, of course, is the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition that was held in Seattle in 1909, a World's Fair that was basically, it was basically one big advertisement by the Seattle Chamber of Commerce to try to position Seattle as the center of commerce for the expanding Pacific world. And so there's a William Seward Day, and they put up this statue, and it's sort of a way of you know, commemorating not Seward himself, because as I said, he has no connection to Seattle, but it's a way that the business elite of Seattle in 1909 could sort of honor themselves, could put up a monument in which their vision of the world is reflected. So I think in a lot of cases when we're talking about these statues, our debates would be better informed if we separated ourselves, separated the matter from the individual, him or herself, and instead turned that lens around and pointed it back at us and asked the question, why did the people who put up this statue put it up when they did? What were the reasons behind it? And then what reasons do we have in the present for either keeping the statue, taking it down, moving it to a museum or whatever? The statues are not about the honored person, they're about us. And that's what we need to examine.
Well, I think, again, of course, I agree with Ross, no surprise. Those are really good points. I guess I would like to think, I too think it's so easy. Well, it's very easy for me to say that those Confederate statues should come down. Although I do think these should be generally local decisions, and I find very distasteful the idea of people coming, you know, from all over the country with their guns or with whatever to demand one solution or another. I think that public discourse is always appropriate, and that can come from anywhere. But in the end, I think these decisions should be made locally, because that's where people are facing those statues every day and perhaps struggling with what they feel when they see those statues. To another point that you kind of raised, I think that when it comes to more nuanced questions about historical figures, I would just love to see these questions open a public discourse, and I would love to have such questions lead to greater understanding. Yes, investigation of the history of when they were established, as Ross says, but also listening to one another and the way that what these statues represent to various members of the community, because they can represent entirely different feelings and ideas and principles. And I think that like we know today what is so lacking in the public discourse is actual listening. We're not listening to one another. We listen to those who are like-minded, and both sides are guilty of that, I would say. And so I think that, you know, a question around a local statue would be a great opportunity for community members to come together, and historians could help with that, you know, help with investigating the history of its establishment, and then maybe community members could really, you know, really come to understand one another better, and soften their stances, and perhaps come to some solutions that might be kind of agreeable all the way around.
Well, in thinking about this and thinking about the Confederate statues, I think a lot of people see it as really kind of this black and white issue, and I think sometimes we in Alaska, we think that we're completely cut off from that history, but I would argue we aren't. The last shots of the Civil War were actually fired in Alaska. There were a lot of there was a whole census district that was named after a Confederate soldier that nobody really even knew any history about, and discovered, oh, wait a minute, what's this doing here? And it was just this happenstance connection, peripheral connection to Alaska. And, another one that I think about of a memorial is the Buckner Field House out on Fort Richardson. And Buckner was the son of a Confederate general and was an out and out racist, and made one of the most abhorrent statements I've ever read about the African-American troops working on the Alaska Highway. So it's not a statue, but I don't think we're completely removed from some of these discussions, but also think about, what are some of the motivations for wanting to take these statues down? And I would argue that some of it, not all of it, but I think some of it comes from people wanting to feel like they're connected on to a larger movement, so to speak, that they can, they can be judged in this moment in history as doing something what they think is positive. But I would argue that, out and out removal isn't always the best way to do that. I think creating dialogues and having discourse and hearing from each other, the pros and cons to, what these are for, is important. And also, I think Ross is absolutely right. What are the motivations of statues? And often, where did even the idea of statues come from? As far as I can tell, it's probably back to the Romans. The Greeks or Romans as sort of these monuments, and what is that whole, what's the motivation there? Because it's not a motivation that we find for indigenous populations that you could argue perhaps. Totem poles are a monument in a way, but they don't usually represent an individual. They tell a history. And I think that they're a way of communicating that history. And I think that we need to think about ways to communicate our history as well.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in again, I think, Aaron's mention of the Wade Hampton Census District is really interesting, because when we talk about statues, it's not just, statues cast in bronze. History of settler colonialism is written literally on the landscape of Alaska in terms of landscapes that are named, geographic features that are named. If anyone has Donald Orth's Dictionary of Alaska Place Names, crack it open right now and look up Dewey Creek. There are at least 12, I think it's 12 different Dewey Creeks in Alaska named for Admiral Dewey, the naval commander who had the decisive victory over the Spanish Navy in the Philippines in 1898. And with all the Klondikers and gold prospectors in the territory at that time, they put Dewey's name on at least a dozen different creeks around Alaska. So if we want to talk about like that aspect specifically, it has nothing to do with Admiral Dewey as an individual. I don't know what kind of guy he was. Was he a racist? Was he a non-racist? Who the hell knows, right? But the fact that his name is on the landscape 12 different times in 12 different places is another wrinkle to this discussion that we're having.
Yeah, and I would just add in the two more prominent ones. Everybody knows the story of McKinley, obviously, but also the Glen Highway, the most trafficked east-west road out of here. I mean, you know, Glenn had a connection to Alaska. He was up here, but he was also a pretty brutal figure and was associated with some what we would consider today to be war crimes, what Congress at the time considered to be war crimes in the Philippines. In the 1890s, and he is, of course, inscribed on the landscape, not in bronze, as Ross points out, but as the most trafficked road, I guess the only road to get in and out of Alaska. We're on the Glen Highway. So I think it's a great discussion. I'm going to skip ahead just because I found this particular train of thought reemerging. So I'm going to actually skip my third question and jump to my fourth. And then I will restate my fourth question in the form of a Q&A, which I think really eloquently is going to summarize what I just posed here. But given the complexities of history and the sloppiness of people, many leaders have accomplished great feats despite deep and troubling personal failings. Why even bother with monuments, memorial statues in the first place? Is it possible that no matter how we design our public spaces and what public figures we choose to elevate, we're still going to be condemned by future generations? Will historians and the broad swaths of the public in 2150, let's just say, approve of the narrative that we've developed here in the 2020s? Does it matter? What do you say to the idea that each generation creates a narrative and a usable past in a way that best suits their purpose? And, you know, again, I think that Ross has already kind of eloquently given voice to this. So maybe another way to ask this question, I'm just going to pull up the Q&A right now. I think this is really insightful. This is from Rachel Myron. I possibly heard it during the public testimony during the City of Sitka's deliberation on the Baranoff statue. Any monument should have an expiration date. So my long-winded paragraph question, I think, could be summarized by that one. Should all statues have an expiration date? So feel free to dig into that however you want.
All right, I'll jump right in. I don't think that they should automatically have an expiration date. However, I think that all statues should always be up for reconsideration because we should always be revisiting history and reconsidering our assessments of individuals and of events in the past based on both new information and on our evolving sense of justice and morality. I think all of this is legitimate. And so, for instance, well, I would just say that I still think that naming buildings and streets and after admirable individuals and building statues to them can have very, very positive purposes. Nevertheless, I do think that our understanding of the past has to be an ongoing discussion, and we must all be ready to question our assumptions and what we think is true.
Yeah, I think following up on what Mary said, I think, yeah, we should have a constant, reevaluation as we, learn new information. I mean, hypothetically, if, a year ago there was a statue put up for Ethan Berkowitz, yeah, I went there. Would there be a reevaluation today versus 6 months ago? I can't think of an individual that probably is beyond some sort of criticism. I mean, we're all human. Even, I've heard, which is not, I'm not supporting this statement, but there is some truth in it that, for example, statues of Martin Luther King, in this constantly reevaluating world, how do we approach, that? So I think there has to be, constant dialogue, and I don't think there's any statue that is so sacred that it can't come down, but it should come down after having thorough discourse and dialogue, and looking at the motivations of why it was erected in the first place.
Yeah, I like this idea of an expiration date. I think that's really fascinating, and it need not only be applied to controversial figures. There are some monuments that simply sort of lose their meaning over time, just due to the passage of time. I think a good example of this is the statue of Charles Bonnell that's on the campus at UAF. Charles Bonnell was the first president of the university from 1917 to 1947 or something like that. I mean, an instrumental figure in the establishment and the survival of the university in Fairbanks. And there's a bronze statue of him right in the middle of campus. I used to, in my classes, I would ask students, does anybody know who Charles Bonnell actually was? And maybe 1 out of 30 actually knew who he was. Today, he's not so much like an honored figure. He's just that guy in the middle of campus that people, dress up in winter clothes at the first snowfall and that kind of thing. So that's an example. I'm not suggesting we get rid of the statue of Charles Bonnell. I'm merely indicating that an expiration date can apply even to non-controversial figures in that way.
Yeah, so this does, I think, leave a better segue into what was originally my third question that I'm now kind of flipping into the fourth. And I guess what I'll ask you guys to do is just kind of shamelessly, in fact, on my behalf as chair of the advocacy committee. So I guess a little background here. One of the reasons I think I was maybe chosen to moderate this panel is that I've been chair of the advocacy committee for the Alaska Historical Society, and one of the things that we have been tasked with, or we felt it was appropriate to tackle, was this issue. And so we did come up with a statement that was quite deliberative, and we went through a couple rounds of revision, and Aaron, one of our panelists here, was quite instrumental in assisting with that effort. And folks I got a cat who's trying to get into the screen. Oh, fun. Okay. And one of the, one of the things that we talked about was, what do we do with these monuments and these statues, and how do we kind of craft a statement that meets the moment, but yet is also kind of sensitive to our membership and is trying to, be politically sensitive to the various viewpoints that our membership has. And so I guess my question is, if you were kind of in the position of advocacy, or, let's say you were the chair of an advocacy committee in a random historical society, we'll just kind of leave it at that. What kind of statement do you think you would have about these monuments? And so one of the things that we decided on was adding additional signage, more discussion of the context in which the figures lived, or even a full recounting of both their achievements as well as their misdeeds, of what would view today as maybe offensive beliefs. But do you view this position as useful, or might we kind of form a more effective solution or stance on these public memorials and monuments? So in short, what is the role of a historical society in crafting a statement, or kind of weighing in on these hot button topics? And I have a follow-up question to this that is kind of out of the same vein, but I'll kind of pose that one first.
Well, one of the things that I really appreciated about the statement from the Historical Society was the mention that rather than just sort of, if a statue is to be taken down, rather than just sort of pitch it in the bin, that it might be moved to a museum where additional historical context might be provided. I think that's a terrific solution. I would never advocate the outright destruction of history, that is taking down a monument and just pitching it in the trash. I would never suggest that, because there's a great deal to be learned from every monument, even the ones that I personally would like to see taken down. And so I really appreciated seeing that in the statement.
Well, I mean, obviously I'm a little biased because I helped craft the one for the Alaska Historical Society. But I think that is the right approach. And I agree with Ross that even the most abhorrent monuments, there is a history there, and a history that does need to be told, and the perspectives of why it went up and what were the motivations behind it. So I'm a really big advocate for education and presenting, the different perspectives. And I do not agree with the idea of, just ripping it down for the sake of ripping it down. I mean, to me, when I see that kind of thing, what it reminds me of is like, knocking down the statues of Saddam Hussein. It's like this, this act of rebellion, I guess, in a way, or making a very clear statement. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't have been taken down, but at the same time, 100 years from now, with all those statues destroyed, what are we going to learn from it? And it is an artifact in a way. And to Ross's point about, it going to museums, I think that is a plausible solution. I think there are times, though, where museums don't necessarily want to wade into that specific topic for that person or whatever. So, the reaction of it instantly being in a museum, I don't think is the right answer, but I think museums can play a role in that.
Aaron, it's like the when a Politburo member fell out with Stalin, his image
Right.
was airbrushed.
Exactly.
From the photographs.
Right.
That's,
I mean, it's literally, wiping out history, and
right,
and
precisely.
sort of expunging it, and that's a dangerous motivation, and it needs to be checked, I would argue.
Very Orwellian, yeah.
Yeah, I certainly don't think that each generation should erase the last generation's perspective on history and write its own, in the Stalinist type model. But on the other hand, and this leads a little bit into the question that Karen posed in the box, what's the difference between, revising, reassessing, and I forgot what other terms she put in there. I think
reassessing, reviewing, and reevaluating.
Okay, and reevaluating. So I generally would use those terms interchangeably in meaning simply that we should always be reconsidering our assessments of our assumptions about the past, and always sort of be willing to question oneself. And this is difficult because it gets at one's own identity. Oftentimes we identify very strongly with specific narratives and specific individuals. So it becomes extremely personal. But if we could, this is an idealist suggestion, I guess, but to the good degree that we can remove ourselves and our own identities from these individuals and this history and just really consider it rationally and invite more perspectives, I think that we all benefit from that. And I think it's a great role for historical societies to provide in a community, because in general, we're trained to look at issues, to examine issues dispassionately. And so we could help guide discussions that would encourage people to consider other perspectives and other ways of viewing this person or this event, and have them realize, complicate the narrative, in other words.
Part of my question was how you compare this reviewing and reassessing with sort of accusations of, well, this isn't that rewriting history?
Well,
I would argue as historians, that's kind of what we do, though. I mean, that the whole point of being a historian is to rewrite history. It is to shine new perspectives on that. So I don't think it's anything new. I think we instinctively do it. I think what we can do, hopefully, is to get it out, that line of thought to a more, to the general public. There are certainly the discussions that, you know, Ross and I might have at a super high level of some technical detail of one facet of somebody's life versus, you know, this facet informed these decisions and this is the outcomes that we had and this is, you know, why we are where we are today. I mean, thinking about, you know, what is going to be the history of Donald Trump is going to be a fascinating tale to be written in the future by historians and reevaluating it.
Yeah, Karen, I want to make clear, when I threw up my hands at that, that wasn't me throwing up my hands at your question. That was just me sort of exclaiming, yes, we rewrite history all the time. That's what we do, right? This is the reason that there are what, 10,000 books about Abraham Lincoln and hundreds more coming out every year. And so I think Aaron is right. I mean, part of our role as historians might be sort of educating the public, not just about history itself, but about the discipline of history. And this is part of it.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add that I think there's that we can learn from, for instance, the process of historiography. When you read biographies or histories that are written in a different era, I mean, you hear a different tone, you hear a different voice, you hear different attitudes. You really smile sometimes. It can be quite amusing. I mean, they can be really quaint. It's very entertaining, and so I'm sure, you know, 50 and 100 years from now, people will think the same about us. Oh, how quaint. She stated it that way, you know. But we have to reconsider the past through the lens of the present, excuse me, to have it have meaning for readers in the present, I think, and to educate people in the present. So this has to be an ongoing process of historians to reevaluate and reconsider in light of our own times and our current perspectives on, for instance, justice and so on.
I'll just say amen to that, because I personally want to be gainfully employed for the next 20 or 30 or 40 years. So let's very much hope that this role for historians continues and that we are asked to critically reappraise the past in ways that bring together historiography and new evidence and everything else. And actually, I'll also just make a quick connection here. That was a kind of perfect flowing conversation that addressed my next follow-up question, which was, what role should historians play? And I think the three of you have more or less answered that. And so I think what I'll probably do now, and I do have one or two questions just, you know, in wait in case no one was going to ask questions, but I see that's not a problem for this panel. I'm not surprised. You guys have really insightful things to say, and I would have been more surprised if we didn't have any questions. But sure enough, we have 7. So I think, you know, I have a couple maybe concluding remarks to make, and again, a few more questions if we're able to get to all of these in our time. But I think I'll defer some of my questions that I had, because the folks who have lined up to ask questions I think have posed really much stronger questions than I had. So without further ado, let's just go to anonymous attendee who is asking the following: has anybody compiled an inventory of statues and monuments that exist across Alaska so that we have a baseline of how many exist? And would it help to have those listed with a statement about context behind its placement, as Ross mentioned? And so this one goes back to 2:19 p.m. So this is about a half hour ago. So some of these questions will maybe skip around a little bit, but I love the question of an inventory. I certainly don't know of one. Do any of you?
No, I don't know of any.
No, I'm not aware. I mean, outside of what, there's probably the state has one for, you know, ones that are on state property or something buried somewhere. But beyond that, no, I'm not aware of any.
Sounds like a good master's thesis for somebody.
It sounds like a project an intern could take on in the history department, if I can say so.
No, I tried at one point. I'm working on a paper right now, and I tried to find what was the first statue put up in Alaska, and I don't say this as a definitive answer because I could be wrong about this, but I think it might be a bust of Felix Pedro that was unveiled in Fairbanks in 1949. Felix Pedro was the mustachioed prospector who discovered gold 12 miles north of the present-day Fairbanks in 1902. And the Italian government, he was an Italian immigrant, and the Italian government commissioned this bust of Felix Pedro. Today it's at the Rasmussen Library in Fairbanks. I think that might be the first one, which actually kind of surprised me that we went until 1947 before the first statue came along. But like I said, I could be wrong about that.
Ross, this is Joe. I think you should look at the statue of the Tsar that stood outside the Kodiak, in Kodiak, that's now owned by the Kodiak Historical Society, but it's a bust of, I can't remember which Tsar.
Okay. Also, the prospector that's in front of the Sitka Pioneer Home, that went up in the late 40s, I believe.
That early?
To all the panelists, this is from Sue Sheriff, great question. If you feel that statues of individuals are an appropriate way to commemorate history, who are some Alaskans who need to be depicted as statues? If not, what are some of the other ways besides erecting statues to give public recognition to history and culture? And Sue, this was my last question, so you've just completely taken my concluding remarks, so I have nothing to offer you guys at the end of this talk. But anyways, I think it's a great question, so dig in.
I'll start. I'll be a little provocative here, but I'm going to say Byron Malott. And the reason I say Byron Malott is that most people don't realize that he played an instrumental role in actually getting recognition for the Dena'ina when he was the head of First Alaskans Institute. He was asked to speak on behalf of the Native people, and Byron knew enough to know that he was on Dena'ina land and that he needed to talk to Dena'ina people. And so he contacted me when I was working at CIRI, and I helped write an article that appeared actually in the newspaper. And it was kind of like the aha moment. As far as I know, it was the first public recognition that this was, the Dena'ina homeland, the native village of Eklutna. This got the attention of the mayor, and eventually when the mayor was putting together a panel for the naming of the Dena'ina Center, that article stuck in the back of his head. And that's just one example of many that Byron had. But I bring up Byron because I think we could have discussions about, does an individual like him merit having a statue?
Well, that's a great example, I think, of how I don't believe that we should totally trash a whole person's record based on one failing. Who hasn't failed, who is faultless in the world. But I have a different suggestion. I have a great example, and it's Walter Harper.
Well, yeah, obviously, Mary, I wholeheartedly support that one as well, but I knew you were going to say that, so I didn't bring him up.
Keep that one up for you, Mary.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for not, stealing my thunder on that one. But I just think this is such a fabulous opportunity, this effort to raise a statue and an installation with interpretive panels that would explain this history, and him and the other individuals who made that, did that extraordinary feat, the first summit of Denali. But there's so much about Walter, I think, that makes him a great example for a statue, because he is just such a fine role model for young people. And I would love it if every young Alaskan, but in particular, if every young Alaska Native person who saw that statue of him, I would like that young person to see him or herself in that person, and want to emulate that person, want to know more about him, and then upon learning more about him, think, wow, that's my heritage. That's who I could be. And I think all children need this. And to me, he could be a hero the world over. But I think that's just a great example of someone, and that I think I can't imagine that it wouldn't stand the test of time also.
Well, my answer to this question is William L. Paul. I can't think of an Alaskan, honestly, more deserving of a statue. The first Alaska Native to pass the bar, the first Alaska Native legislator, gained the right to vote for Natives in 1924. With his brother Lewis, successfully challenged Alaska's segregated school system. In the 1930s, he worked with Congress to establish on legislation that would help for the establishment of tribal governments. Filed a series of land claims lawsuits that, although none were successful, laid the legal groundwork for the Claims Settlement Act in 1971. I mean, William Paul, by any measure, is a giant of Alaska history. Mm-hmm. And he's such a fascinating example. And here's sort of where I become the pointy-headed academic again. I don't think he ever will have a statue in Alaska, at least not on public grounds, because he was so controversial, because he raised uncomfortable questions about racial injustice, about the continued social, economic, and political marginalization of Natives. He was actually opposed to the land claims settlement in 1971, alienated himself even from the Native community with his strident belief that any compromise represented defeat. And when ANCSA was settled in 71 and the Natives corporations received 44 million acres of land, Paul was incensed because he wanted 375 million acres of land. My point here is that William Paul, for all of his credentials, he raised such uncomfortable questions about racial injustice. The concerns that he raised cannot be relegated to the past. He's not safe. He's not a figure that sort of everyone can see themselves in. Rather, William Paul is a historical figure, a statue of whom would really force us to confront ongoing issues of injustice. All too often, that's not the kind of hero that we want. We prefer someone safe, someone, you know, whose controversies can be relegated to the past. Sorry, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean to bring us down again.
No.
Well, and also, you know, Ross, I mean, William Paul also, you could argue, played the political game better than his white counterparts and was ultimately
Precisely.
discredited and kicked out of the legislature for playing against a stacked deck. And I'm not making a judgment about that, but that is part of his legacy and part of his history. And were there to ever be a statue, I think that's also another important issue that would need to be raised in that.
Agreed.
And it just goes to show somebody like him had all sorts of, you know, complexities.
I think he's a great example of someone who should be memorialized because memorials and statues and commemorative landscapes should educate the public. And I think that there surely was a time when there wouldn't have been a statue for him. But if it's not today, I would hope that the time would come when we could recognize the courage that he exhibited and that we're all better off for it. I mean, look at someone like Martin Luther King. Okay, because he was assassinated, he got statues pretty fast and streets named after him pretty quickly. But I know that there were plenty of people at the time whom he made very uncomfortable, who 20 years later really, really respect and admire him and recognize that, you know, what a courageous leader he was. So I think there's already enough time has passed that I would hope today's Alaskans would recognize that he was spot on in a lot of his observations and that he was incredibly courageous.
Yeah, and Mary, that's a great example. But even that is more complicated, right? Because, and I'm not disagreeing with you, you're exactly right, but we venerate Martin Luther King today because he ended racism, right? Again, because the issue on which he fought can be relegated to the past, theoretically at least. The parts of Martin Luther King that are never brought up in commemorations today, however, his opposition to the Vietnam War, his opposition to US militarism and imperialism more generally, his stance on economic injustice, his comments on police brutality. And we don't mention any of those issues because they remain live and divisive in the present. It's only when the issues can be relegated to the past that we feel comfortable commemorating those heroes. I don't take that as a disagreement, Mary. I think you're exactly right, but it's another example of how complicated these things are.
I'll just add one because as moderator, I'm feeling sidelined and wish to just throw in another name or two here. And I don't disagree with any of these. I think these are really wonderful options, and I think they really give us a complicated view of history, which is what they should. I'll just mention a couple that come to mind. The Black workers and soldiers who participated in the construction of the Alaska-Canada Highway, and there's been a lot of work done on this. It would be wonderful to see a monument to them. And to me, what I find so revelatory about that particular instance is the way in which this ties into this broader narrative of civil rights in this country. And I think I, for one, have become really tired of Alaska being viewed as the, quote, last frontier, right? And so one of the things I'm always trying to teach in my classes is the fact that this is not the last frontier in really any respect. I mean, this is a place that in a lot of cases is at the forefront of these really pivotal American social movements. And when Harry Truman goes to desegregate the military, he does so not because of the participation of the Black troops on the Alaska-Canada Highway, but at least that's the backdrop. And I think it is that participation that kind of paves the way towards this really germinal moment in the history of American civil rights that has been completely written out of the story. Now, here's the flip side of that. As we were talking about this morning in the earlier panel, and this didn't even occur to me, embarrassingly enough, the construction of the Alaska Highway had a really terrible impact on the indigenous people in the Yukon. And the gentleman at the panel earlier kind of brought this up, and I'm thinking, wow, I mean, here you have this case where this really landmark moment in the history of American civil rights also has this kind of flip side to it that brings all of these unintended consequences to the native peoples of the Yukon and presumably into interior Alaska. So I think it is complicated, and I think the discussion is an incredibly rich one, worth having. I'd also throw in Mahala Ashley Dickerson, who was the first African-American homesteader in the Mat-Su. She was close friends with Rosa Parks, and she had taken on all kinds of really messy, divisive cases here in Anchorage, including against the University of Alaska, against the Anchorage Police Department, and she won just about all those cases, if I'm not mistaken. But a really fascinating figure whose home is still in the valley, and she was a Quaker and has a really interesting history that people can read more on, but she has not been publicly memorialized in any way that I'm aware of. So I'll just throw those two into the mix, but let's get back to the questions. We don't have many statues, but we do have a lot of interpretive signage that often represents Euro-American settler colonialism history, but often doesn't represent indigenous history very well. How about taking down more Euro-American place names for more indigenous place names? If Sheldon Jackson had not closed, should we have removed the name from the school? He represents institutional racism for many Alaska natives. And so this is from Daniel Montaigne. So the idea here is, what do we do about place names, I think? And that's another really interesting topic that I think we in Alaska are particularly well suited to talk about, given this kind of rich indigenous history that we share.
Well, I think, to that point, because I do a lot of work in that particular area, one of the things that I would like to actually see, a first step in my mind, is actually doing an inventory of all the sort of anglicized indigenous names that already exist. I mean, our state is named after an indigenous word, but do people really understand the true, meaning of what that word comes from? What is the history? We have a lot of, indigenous names, and this isn't just for Alaska. I would actually argue for a lot of the United States. We don't really equate, Kenai or Susitna, Non-Dalton as indigenous names. We just, they kind of roll off the tongue, but we don't know the history behind them. So an effort that I would like to see is not unlike what Orth did, but kind of take that and take it a step further and make it part of the curriculum in our schools as a first step. But certainly, you know, there is a process in place to get names changed, and there has been some efforts for that.
I think too that we can continually reconsider place names. After all, some might be named after no one anybody remembers whatsoever, and each generation might have its own heroes and people, you know, community-minded individuals who you know, might merit having a street named after them. And so I don't think it always would have to be a super contentious thing. I think it could be, you know, an ongoing community effort to have, you know, have the community have meaning for people in a variety of ways. And it could be very inclusive, and you know, it wouldn't have to be extremely contentious like tearing down statues.
So I see a couple comments here. Maybe instead of an expiration date, we have a 10-year reconsideration date for various monuments by local review committees. There we go. We set up a local review committee to evaluate the relevance and proper history of a statue on a 10-year rolling basis. I could maybe get behind that. We'll see. Depends on who the committee's comprised of, right? What do you think about a retirement home? Okay, this is a question I think people could dig into. What do you think about a retirement home or rogues gallery? I love that phrase, for retired or expired statues. For example, in Budapest, Hungary, there is a park that many of the dismantled Soviet era statues are gathered and contextualized. And this is from an anonymous attendee. So a rogues gallery or retirement home for statues, yay or nay?
Sounds interesting to me.
I guess I wouldn't oppose it. It could be quite interesting, and it might, you know, it might have a lot of visitors. It wouldn't be my first priority.
Right. We're hurting economically, so maybe, you know,
Right.
any good
Yeah,
idea.
we have bigger fish to fry.
All right, so this is from Doug Vandergraft. Naming a geographic feature is a very good way to honor someone. However, the honoree should have a connection to Alaska, and preferably a direct connection to the actual place being named. Kind of a tall order, he says. And so, not so much a question, but a comment. But I guess if anyone wants to weigh in on this, and I think Ross already has in a way, and we talked about Wade Hampton, and there are certainly a few other examples of this, but yeah, the idea of geographic features, I think one of the things emerging in this discussion is if we're going to commemorate landscapes, I think we need to have a really clear, the people need to have a really clear and explicit connection to the land. And I don't think that's a controversial statement.
No, I would agree. And I think, you know, there are names out there that, that we use every day that we really don't know the history behind. I would argue the name of our capital after Joe Juneau leaves a lot to be desired, and nobody that I'm aware of has brought up that issue, you know, as an example.
You know, I hate to introduce, you know, more controversy here, but, you know, Ian, you've written about the move in the 1980s to name the Performing Arts Center in Anchorage after Dr. King. And then I think there was a corresponding move to name, was it 9th Avenue after Dr. King? Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, and I'll give the follow up to this, but yeah.
And I was just going to say, I mean, that's an example of someone without an Alaska connection who is nevertheless deserving of the honor. And when the proposal is named, people who lived and business owners on that street objected because they thought it was going to impact their property values. Again, another case of how we are never separated from the past, right?
Yeah. Well, and so what ended up happening with that, I won't retell the whole story. There may be folks who were actually involved in some of the city council meetings. This was in Anchorage, and began in the late 80s and kind of carried on as a controversy through the 90s. And the one figure who was kind of at the forefront of this, a fellow by the name of Don Smith, who is still very much so active in Anchorage city politics, proposed that a building in Fairview be named after Martin Luther King, because that was where kind of all of, quote, those people lived anyways. And so a lot of the kind of rhetoric around this was really quite divisive and racist. And so this kind of galvanized the community to then get some private funding for the statue the statue or the plaque, I guess, that now rests right as you come up into Anchorage along L Street. But yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting case study of this discussion of this national figure who has national prominence, but yet is sort of opposed because he is seen as not Alaskan enough. But yet, if you just scratch the surface a little bit, it actually turns out to be be quite a bit more problematic than just the claim that, well, he doesn't have a claim to Alaska. There was I think a pretty nasty undertone to those discussions, but I think it does kind of raise a really interesting point about, especially here in Alaska, where I've lived in a couple different places, and the idea of being properly Alaskan is really important, I think, to people in the state. You look at our politics, and it's always a question of who raised their kids in Alaska or who has lived in Alaska the longest. And so I do think that that question takes on particular weight here, maybe more so than anywhere else I've ever lived. And so it is a fascinating point. So here's just another comment from an anonymous attendee. I don't know if people want to deal with this or not, but I thought it was interesting. Not only are they artifacts, they're also pieces of art created by artists. And so I suspect part of the impetus behind this comment is that we've been talking a lot about the history, obviously. This is a panel of historians, right? But should we lose sight of the fact that, maybe some of these really, I don't know, maybe objectionable people, maybe they're just really interesting pieces of art. Does that matter to anybody on this panel? Should there be consideration given to the artistic merits of the statue based upon their creation by an artist?
Well, I'll just jump right in on that. So I'm a great lover of the arts, but I don't think that can be the overwhelming factor if it's a case of a person who absolutely should, whom we learn later or decide later, absolutely should not be venerated. I mean, I don't care how beautiful a statue of Hitler is, that he's just easy to agree on, right?
Yeah.
We don't need to keep it just because it was particularly beautifully rendered. It just doesn't hold up.
I'm very much inclined to agree with that assessment, Mary, very much so. But again, that's the historian in me. I'm not an artist.
Well, yeah, I agree with Mary, except that if it was on the artistic merit alone, then put it in an art museum and talk about create the context around it. Now, I do agree, though, it would be very difficult to have a statue of Hitler in an art museum and not see it viewed in a different lens, no matter how, or Stalin or Lenin. I mean, you could go down the list.
So David Ramser poses a question. David is also on the Alaska Historical Society Advocacy Board, who was quite instrumental. In fact, he had the first draft written, much of which kind of ended up passing muster and becoming the final draft of our statement. So David did a spectacular job on that. And he's posing a question again about the Historical Society's role. And he asks, do you think it's a proper role of the Historical Society to offer its assistance to communities considering erecting, taking down, or moving statues? A Lenda historian type program. And this gets back to the question that I didn't ask, which was, again, effectively, what role is it that we as historians play in providing our counsel to the greater public? This is another iteration of that question. I think it's a good one.
Well, I think to answer it, Ian, yeah, I would say absolutely. I mean, I think that's, again, one of the roles of what I would argue is good historians, is being that conduit to the public. You know, if we're just talking to each other, then in a way it becomes, you know, kind of another form of an echo chamber. So I think it is important that, you know, we get involved in these kinds of issues, or at least to offer an opinion.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I would also say, however, that I'll speak only for myself, not for my fellow panelists. If any community invited me to come and give a talk, I would be happy to stand up and pontificate in my usual sermonizing tone, but I don't know that that would be helpful. As helpful to the debate as would sort of a more of a community forum or discussion in which the community members are asked, you know, what do you like about this statute? What do you dislike? What do you appreciate? What do you think it means? I think that in certain respects would be much more useful than whatever, as Aaron said, whatever sort of academic input that we might provide.
I would just add, I appreciated both Aaron and Ross's points, but I think that, you know, an historian could be part of that panel discussion, because that person could really help to bring to light issues that the general public might not be aware of, considerations that they might want to take up now instead of regretting perhaps in a few years when something comes to light. So I think that the more that sort of the homework is done ahead of time by a community before erecting the statue, the better. And I think that historians can really help with that, but that they shouldn't, it's not like we're the only authorities, obviously.
It's been an interesting balance for me to watch this debate unfold, because, you know, on the one hand, I think as historians, we are people who've gone through a credentialing process, and we have something to say from a kind of specialized form of knowledge that we spent years and years obtaining. And you know, at risk of sounding elitist, I do want to be included in the conversation. But at the same time, I mean, I think that's always against the balance of community concerns and against voices that have been historically marginalized by academic institutions. And so I think there's a real balance there. And I think that, you know, to the extent that we engage in these discussions as historians or as historical societies, we do so with caution and we do so with humility. But I also do very much so hope that we do so. I guess that would be maybe my rejoinder to this. Katie Ringsmith has a good point here. She just raises not so much a question, but a comment. I always caution my students about judging the past. Values are fluid, and what we think is right or wrong in 2020 were not the same values that defined views in, let's say, 1967. Our job as students of history is to explain why, but as humans, we can judge all we want. And so I guess there is this balance, right, between maybe our role in the classroom and our role as professional historians or active members in a historical society. But that doesn't certainly preclude us from getting a drink and over beer talking all kinds of trash on historical actors. So I mean, I think that's right. We can always judge. Let's see. So here's a question. This is from Penelope Goforth, an incoming board member. Thank you, Penelope, for this one. Kudos to the AHS for making the statement on monuments. I think it's incumbent on historical societies and historians to speak out on behalf of current issues like this and to educate the public. As Ross mentioned, many students aren't even taught who Bunnell was and why he is on the campus. What are your thoughts on active education and advocacy?
Well, I mean, I think that's how I started my whole presentation was, yes, I think it's critical. And I think, and I'm going to just reiterate this again, I think that, you know, we do a huge disservice to our entire state by not teaching a robust Alaska history program in our schools. I graduated high school without having a Alaska history requirement. And what has been done, it leaves a lot to be desired, and it's an effort that's bigger than any one institution. And I know we've had a lot of discussions at the Anchorage Museum about that, but I think we have to continually champion this idea that we have, an important role in trying to get our history out there so that we can understand and make educated decisions for our future.
I think one of the most important roles that we can play in schools, whether it's, elementary or middle school or high school or universities, is to help students understand that it was complicated. And so I'm a little uncomfortable with the term advocacy as historians, because I think that the best thing that we can do for students is to have them understand more than when they came into the room or into the class that, those assumptions I was making, I see now. Oh, there was much more to it. It was much more nuanced than I thought. And, and that they then would leave the room or leave the class realizing that, just really understanding a lot more and being more open to that process of questioning their own assumptions and being eternally curious, and willing and eager to hear another perspective. So I'm not sure what the questioner meant by advocacy, but I think it makes me a little uncomfortable as historians to promote that word. And so I just would, unless we're advocating the study of history.
And you know what, Mary, I'll just jump in and say, I think it is a follow-up that is what she's talking about here. And this may be one reason we have a generation of young people who don't know history. And so she goes on to ask, how would you encourage schools to emphasize history as a way to promote educated civil discourse? And I think that the way that we can do advocacy and do it effectively is to just really make sure that that history is taught in schools. And I know the initial topics about the statement that the AHS had on monuments and statues, Aaron brought up what I thought to be a really brilliant point about just the need for history being taught. We're working at such a deficit now, and I don't think that any three of you would disagree that we need more history in schools, or we need a revised curriculum to update, I think, and revise much of the history that has been taught over the last however long. And so I don't think that that's a particularly divisive question where we're going to get lots of disagreement. Ross, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I also, Ian, I think it's worth our consideration of what exactly mean when we say teach more history, because that in and of itself is a complicated question, right? And apropos of what Mary said a moment ago, I remember one of the first things that Terrence Cole taught me the first time I took a class from him 20 plus years ago. He said something along the lines of, I don't care if you don't remember what date some historical event happened. I want you to develop critical thinking skills so that you can question your assumptions and you can sort of be an active participant, not just in the memorization of history, but in the interpretation of it. So I think that's another thing we need to keep in mind. We say teach more history as though that the meaning of that term were self-evident, and I don't think it is.
Well, yeah, real quick. Yeah. And actually that's a good point, Ross, because that actually, you've hit it on the head. And that is actually when presenting history that we teach critical thinking. That in and of itself is actually probably the most important skill that I would argue needs to be taught in school. And I was lucky to have some of it in high school taking debate, but I realized how few of my friends or contemporaries had that kind of exposure to ask the questions, to say, why are these things the way they are, and how can I learn more, and how do I have the tools to be able to disseminate information and filter it through to form an opinion.
And just as I say that, I'll give you one quick complicating issue to consider. I mean, on the topic of teaching history, I for one get very worried by the prospect of, say, state legislatures or the federal government or Congress or whoever it is kind of imposing some type of historical standards. We just saw the 1776 commission proposed by the president. And you know, I think this was mostly just kind of a rhetorical flourish, but I do think that we need to be at once kind of advocating history, but also be a little bit cautious about what it means for, again, state legislatures, Congress, whoever it is, to kind of impose standards or tell us what we should or shouldn't be teaching. I think that really crosses a sacred line. So we only have about, let's see here, 10 minutes left, and I have a lot of comments that are piling up. I'll certainly mention Katie Ringsmith's comment here that Gene Pollard and others are working actively on the Alaska Highway project, and so I think that's been a project that Katie far more than myself has been active on, and it kind of represents this idea between scholars and folks in the community working together to try to have a memorialization of the highway. So I certainly agree with that. Tim writes, we passed up the opportunity back in the 80s to name the Performing Arts Center after MLK. So that's part of those of you who don't know the full history in Anchorage with the Martin Luther King monument today off the Park Strip. The original proposal was to name the Performing Arts Center after Martin Luther King. So again, that's a tie-in with place names and how we have conceived of our commemorative landscape. Well, I just want to, again, with apologies, I don't think we're going to be able to get through the next 4 or 5 questions here, but we'll at least go to maybe 1 or 2 more, and then I'll give people maybe a minute or so for final statements if they want to wrap up with anything. But here's one from Rebecca Paulson. Maybe, as Aaron has said, the goal could be better history education with the goal of critical or historical thinking, seeing a monument as an artifact, telling us, as Ross says, more about the moment it was put up rather than a statue is the same as whomever it represents. Even if it's people we consider heroes or deserving, et cetera, or very beautiful, it be with full context, basically a history exhibit goal, not a monument to praise. And that's the question. Like the statue of Baranoff, if not in such a prominent location, would it be a hook for learning? Anyone wants to take that on? No. Let's see here. I'm just going through these. Some of these we've addressed in some way, shape, or form. Having lived in a community where relatively small long-term residents were repeatedly overwhelmed by newcomers arriving for economic reasons, I think historians can play a vital part in discussion, providing view across the decades. More of a comment. Colton writes, how do you all feel about, oops, hold on here. The comments are skipping around. How do you feel about the role of large corporations? This is an interesting one we haven't discussed. How do you feel about the role of large corporations with economic incentives, in particular to practices sponsoring memorials? For example, the Cook statue in Anchorage was established in 1976 bicentennial by British Petroleum while the TAPS was being constructed. That's important context.
It is, and that was, one of the things I argued is I said, when we were talking about the Captain Cook statue, I said, who's had a bigger impact on Alaska, Captain Cook or British Petroleum? And there was sort of a deafening silence. And you could also argue on the flip side, who's had a bigger colonial impact on Alaska, British Petroleum or Captain Cook? As I also said, Captain Cook showing up here didn't mean that we learned how to play cricket. So, I put that out there, but I think that is part of the discussion and the motivation. It should be pointed out though, too, that it was British Petroleum's gift to actually commemorate the bicentennial of the United States. So it's got layer upon layer of it.
Agreed.
Yeah, I would just add that while I do think we definitely should question motives and question the whole context. I am a believer in corporate social responsibility, and I think that it's important that we actually demand that corporations that are making lots of money in our state give back. And making a donation to an art center or to some kind of commemoration can be an appropriate way for them to do that, especially if we think of such installations as educational.
So Janet Clemens makes the comment about not recommending statues. Many communities reflect their histories and more by painting a series of murals on sides of buildings and perhaps have been less contentious. Is it the impermanence of paint as opposed to a freestanding metal statue that seemed to have a longer life? Yeah, we haven't really talked about that. I know here in Anchorage, we're seeing, I think, part of the Seed Lab in the Anchorage Museum, and Aaron could speak more to this than I can with his role at the museum, but we're seeing more murals around town that have been, I think, at least in part kind of sponsored or kind of spun through the museum. And I think that they do tell a story and they do tell history, but there's something significantly less permanent to them. And maybe that is the future of commemorative landscapes is the mural. I don't know if people want to weigh in on that. It's an interesting point.
Just real quick, yeah, there is an impermanence to that, and there's pros and cons to that. A good example of that is in the city of Kenai. There was a mural that was commissioned for the bicentennial of Kenai, sort of Cook's arrival. And the artist that painted it contacted the Kenaitze tribe and painted this view of first contact with the Dena'ina. And the city reacted quite, for the most part, negatively to it. And it was sort of relegated to the side of a less prominent building, and eventually was painted over or taken down. I can't remember which.
So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I just want to thank the panelists for what I think has been an incredibly lively discussion with really thought-provoking points and provocative points at times, but that's really the point, I think. Katie Ringsmith does have a point. I just have to say my son, who is a freshman this year, is taking Alaska Studies. I have to say I was surprisingly impressed with the class. I guess my point is for us to think of collaborating with teachers and working with them in a bigger goal of educating our kids. And I think that really does kind of cut to what has become maybe a big sub theme running throughout this conversation, which is, maybe where does that barrier exist between like professional historians and historical societies with the broader public, whether they're, whether they're muralists or teachers or whoever else. And I think we've been doing a really good job of interrogating where that line is and where it should be. But I'll kick things over to our panelists to maybe just say a thing or two that we should be thinking about on the topic of commemorative landscapes as we all head for the proverbial virtual doors here in the next couple minutes.
Well, maybe I'll just jump in first and give a shout out to Katie for a great point. And it reminds me that we folks at universities can be doing much more outreach and collaboration with the teachers in public schools, I think. But finally, I guess I would just say that I think that discussions like this are just so stimulating, and it's just so refreshing. It's just so refreshing to have a discussion with others that is respectful, and that is we can learn from one another. And I just would hope that this type of discussion could be modeled, that we could model this type of discussion elsewhere in our communities, and to try to get us back to a better place in this country.
Agreed, 100%.
And I would like to close by saying that this is literally the first time in 6 months that I've worn a collared shirt. And so I thank you for the opportunity.
Mine's a flannel, but you guys can't really see that, so that's okay.
Well, hopefully you took a shower too, Ross. It hasn't been 6 months since you've taken a shower. But no, I just want to thank the other panelists. I think it is important to have these type of dialogues. I think they're important. I think to Katie's point, yes, I wholeheartedly agree that it's important that we collaborate with with the school system, that we find ways to spread our view of history, and raise some of the issues that we've been talking about here, and get kids to think about this. And also, I would say that we live in a state where we have the ability to affect history, and that shouldn't be lost, that every individual has the ability, because of, partially because of our population size, but just, in communities, the impacts that you can have are pretty significant, I would argue.
I asked Ian this question, that there was a comment in the chat that there's just the one Ian I think should be mentioned, which is that Elizabeth Cook mentioned that 10 years ago, a large group of folks met in Anchorage to create high school curriculum. Great work, which went nowhere. I thought that related to this discussion at the end here. So,
yeah. Well, no, I mean, and I think there is a way to maybe just wrap up on that point, is that, here we are in this really dynamic, interesting discussion. And I guess my only addendum to it would be that I certainly hope that this does not go nowhere, right? That this kind of builds on the momentum that we've been discussing, and that the people who have obviously participated in this panel and everybody else who has just been following along, I mean, feel some inspiration to get involved with their community and take history public, right? And I think, all of us have a really valuable perspective on this material, and some of us have, really highly specialized training, but, maybe we haven't made the connections with the community that we should have. And I think there's a real clarion call here to make those connections, and to grow where we're planted, or whatever the phrase is. And I think, just to echo Aaron's point, it is true. I mean, Alaska, in my 10 years that I've been here, I've noticed these kind of pathways to just get involved are very much so open, and far more open than they are than any place I've ever lived. And so I, for one, am just grateful for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I'm grateful to live in this place with really wonderful, smart people, and to share my voice with everybody. So I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank everyone for participating, and I very much hope that this is the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of a conversation. So have a great rest of your day, and we will see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. for the last day of the Alaska Historical Society 2020 conference. Thanks again to Joe and Karen for making sure we're running smoothly.
yeah, I would just say that tomorrow at 10, it's a session on Russian America with Steve Haycox and Dawn Black, moderated by David Ramser. And at 2 o'clock, it's Alaska Canneries. Bob King, Angela Grantham, and Katie Wingsmith will be presenting during that session. So hope to see everybody tomorrow.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Good stuff. Thank you all.